Is reality as we know it a simulation? No, probably not. But let's take the so-called simulation hypothesis seriously, so that we can figure out why it's not as likely as its proponents might lead you to believe. In my opinion, the so-called simulation hypothesis isn't even really a hypothesis. It's more akin to a religious belief than anything. And when I say religious belief, I don't mean that it is like a religious institution such as Christianity or Buddhism. I mean, any given two Christians might have some discrepancies between the finer points of their theology. What I mean is that it is a belief that is religious, more similar to something like divine revelation than an entire theological construction. It might be a religious belief that bases itself in things that are ostensibly scientific, but any work of science fiction is also ostensibly scientific. That doesn't make it science. Simulation hypothesis, frankly, is not science, but we should take it seriously so that we know how to engage with it. In today's video, we're going to go through Nick Bostrom's paper representing the probabilistic argument for simulation, and we're going to look at it under a critical lens. To be clear, this topic deserves like a 200+ page book, but I only have a week to try and figure out how I'm going to explain this. Shit's about to get really complicated. But for those of you with a curious mind who enjoy critical thinking, agree or disagree, I hope I can at least give you some things to think about.
Hey bro, I just thought of something.
What, bro?
What if we're in a simulation?
Just pass the blunt, bro.
La da da, a toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. And ba da da, toast to the good man who did his best, but it was never good enough for them. La da da.
To be fair to Nick, he proposes a trilemma. He doesn't just come out and say, I believe we're in a simulation, but he does spend nearly the entire paper arguing for it. But let's dig into it. This paper argues at least one of the following propositions is true. 1. The human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a post-human stage. My criticism already is, what do you mean by post-human? This is kind of sounding like ambiguous mysticism, but let's hear him out. 2. Any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof. The level of precision that these simulations would require demands a deterministic theory of everything. Bostrom doesn't think so, but we'll get into why momentarily. For now, let's continue reading. 3. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. It follows that the belief that there is a significant chance we will one day become post-humans who run ancestor simulations is false, unless we are currently living in a simulation. Nick is saying that if it is true that we can run such simulations, then we are likely living in one. I don't see how this follows from whether or not we can create a deterministic theory of everything, but maybe he clears this up. Let's continue with his argument. Many works of science fiction, as well as some forecasts by serious technologists and futurologists, predict that enormous amounts of computing power will be available in the future. Well, the predictions of science fiction don't always pan out, and as it stands, we're limited by the end of Moore's law. Moore's law states that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles approximately every 2 years. But this trend is reaching its physical limitations. We can't build logical operators, let alone computers smaller than the smallest particles that exist, i.e. the Standard Model. One thing that later generations might do with their super powerful computers is run detailed simulations of their forebears or of people like their forebears. Because their computers would be so powerful, they could run a great many such simulations. Even if we had a deterministic theory of everything, there is no guarantee that computing power will ever get that good. And even if computing power gets that good, there is no guarantee that there is a perfectly deterministic theory of everything. Bostrom doesn't think we need a deterministic theory of everything, but again, we will soon address why I think we do. This continues to highlight the speculative nature of Bostrom's argument. Suppose these simulated people are conscious, as they would be if the simulations were sufficiently fine-grained and if a certain, quite widely accepted position in the philosophy of mind is correct. Sufficiently fine-grained is doing a lot of work here because of Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. Searle's Chinese room thought experiment goes something like this. Imagine a person, like me, who doesn't understand Chinese. I am put in a room with a rule book that allows me to translate Chinese characters into another set of Chinese characters. By following the rulebook, I can produce responses in Chinese that seem meaningful to a Chinese speaker outside the room. However, I don't actually understand the semantic meaning of what I'm saying. I'm just manipulating symbols based on the rules given to me. This demonstrates the difference between simulated understanding, where I appear to understand Chinese, and true understanding, where I actually comprehend the things I'm saying. The experiment suggests that true consciousness involves more than just processing information according to a set of rules. It requires genuine understanding, regardless of the sophistication of our method. Even a maximally fine-grained simulation doesn't prove consciousness, so stating that they would be isn't a fact, and relying on the popularity of a given philosophy of mind belief is a fallacious appeal to authority. This supposition further adds to the speculative nature of this argument, which Bostrom hand-waves away with the insinuation that the idea is popular. Bostrom continues, then it could be the case that the vast majority of minds like ours do not belong to the original race, but rather to people simulated by the advanced descendants of an original race. It is then possible to argue that, if this were the case, we would be rational to think that we are likely among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones. Bostrom is effectively saying that if computing power gets good enough, then it is more likely that we are a part of a simulated reality than a real reality, since there would be more simulated realities than real ones. Are we also considering the possibility that there may be an infinite number of real realities, a fraction of which might be able to compose consciousness yet not contain such simulations, which would mean that there could also potentially be more real realities than could be simulated, regardless of the computational power achievable within our reality. Bostrom continues, saying, therefore, if we don't think that we are currently living in a computer simulation, we are not entitled to believe that we will have descendants who will run lots of such simulations of their forebears. That is the basic idea. The rest of the paper will spell it out more carefully. Wrong. This is a huge leap. The correct version would be if we don't think it's possible that we are currently living in a computer simulation, we are not entitled to believe that we will have descendants who will run lots of such simulations of their forebears. And even that is, like, not necessarily true. This idea is also completely incompatible with the notion of free will. On its face, believers in libertarian free will and most compatibilists ought to reject this, which means, for his argument, we are presupposing hardline determinism. Apart from the interest this thesis may hold for those who are engaged in futuristic speculation, there are also more purely theoretical rewards. This argument provides a stimulus for formulating some methodological and metaphysical questions, and it suggests naturalistic analogies to certain traditional religious conceptions, which some may find amusing or thought-provoking. Correct. This is, in my opinion, a religious belief, not a scientific one. It stretches naturalism beyond its known limitations. But let's continue. A common assumption in the philosophy of mind is that of substrate independence. The idea is that mental states can supervene on any of a broad class of physical substrates. For those of you unfamiliar with all of these $2 words, Bostrom is basically saying that mental states or cognitive functions can be realized in multiple ways. For example, the same mental state, like experiencing pain, can occur in different organisms with different neurobiological makeups, or even potentially in artificial systems. Of course, Searle's Chinese Room points out that this assumption may not be the case. Arguments for this thesis have been given in the literature, and although it is not entirely uncontroversial, we shall take it here as a given. Correct, but at least he acknowledges it. He does get some credit for that. The argument we shall present does not, however, depend on any very strong form of functionalism or computationalism. For example, we need not assume that the thesis of substrate independence is necessarily true, either analytically or metaphysically, just that, in fact, a computer running a suitable program would be conscious. He's basically saying that it only has to be possible to create consciousness with computers, not necessarily anything you could build a logic gate out of, and that not all civilizations need to be able to produce programs that would be conscious, only that it has to be physically possible for some or one civilization to do it. Moreover, we need not assume that in order to create a mind on a computer, it would be sufficient to program it in such a way that it behaves like a human in all situations, including passing the Turing test, etc. We only need the weaker assumption that it would suffice for the generation of subjective experiences that the computational processes of a human brain are structurally replicated in suitably fine-grained detail, such as on the level of individual synapses. This attenuated version of substrate independence is quite widely accepted. So basically, Bostrom's view allows for the possibility of generating consciousness without requiring perfect human-like behavior in all scenarios. However, if you don't require that your simulations behave human in all situations, then why do humans act like humans in all situations? If someone honestly believed that our reality was a simulated one, then wouldn't these alleged simulations need to encompass all facets of our reality? Additionally, if we were currently in a simulation, then these assumptions have formed a perspective that is analogous to solipsism, the literal least accepted and respected philosophical belief, with the most meaningful differences being that instead of all reality being produced by one's own mind, all of reality is being generated by a computer, and instead of assuming there is only one real conscious mind, your own, Nick is arguing that a subset of conscious minds are real. Neurotransmitters, nerve growth factors, and other chemicals that are smaller than a synapse clearly play a role in human cognition and learning. The substrate independence thesis is not that the effects of these chemicals are small or irrelevant, but rather that they affect subjective experience only via their direct or indirect influence on computational activities. For example, if there can be no difference in subjective experience without there also being a difference in synaptic discharges, then the requisite detail of simulation is at the synaptic level or higher. This would only establish what is good enough of an upper bound to convincingly trick us, not actually simulate all of existing reality and history. Tricking us, even convincingly, is not the same thing as recreating the thing. If we aren't recreating the thing exactly, then the notion of the thing we occupy being reality falls apart. In which case, I don't know what is meant by the term reality in this context. If we were in a simulation, then that definition is unknowable unless we could somehow break out of the simulation and come back. At our current stage of technological development, we have neither sufficiently powerful hardware nor the requisite software to create conscious minds and computers. But persuasive arguments have been given to the effect that if technological progress continues unabated, then these shortcomings will eventually be overcome. Yeah, again, that's a big if, because simulated consciousness still does not necessarily mean consciousness, according to Searle's Chinese room, no matter the level of sophistication. As we are still lacking a theory of everything, we cannot rule out the possibility that novel physical phenomena not allowed for in current physical theories may be utilized to transcend those constraints. This is true. It is possible, but it's strange to be using a lack of a theory of everything, which the lack of is in itself a constraint on this theory, to justify this theory. This is appealing to the mysticism of the unknown, as we truly don't know if we will ever have a deterministic theory of everything, or if it will allow for the computational rigor necessary for our simulations. We can, with much greater confidence, establish the lower bounds on post-human computation by assuming only mechanisms that are already understood. For example, Eric Drexler has outlined a design for a system the size of a sugar cube, excluding cooling and power supply, that would perform 10 to the power of 21 instructions per second. Our best supercomputer at current can do 10 to the power of 18 instructions per second, but we have 10 to the power of 80 atoms, not subatomic particles, in the observable universe alone. Tricking us is not good enough. For example, suppose there is a planet in the universe but outside of the observable universe housing other conscious entities. Then, 1,000,000 years from now, we eventually make contact with them. Well, they still existed before our awareness of them, and a simulation of just the observable universe wouldn't be able to account for them. So even simulating all of the observable universe wouldn't be enough to establish that we are in a simulation. The amount of computing power needed to estimate a human mind can likewise be roughly estimated. Approximately 10 to the power of 14 operations per second for the entire human brain. An alternative estimate, based on the number of synapses in the brain and their firing frequencies, gives a figure of around 10 to the power of 16 to 10 to the power of 17 operations per second. Under a belief of libertarian free will, and for many compatibilists, this is actually impossible regardless of the technical aspects, since consciousness is decidedly beyond the reach of mere code or rule sets. And even if this was true, under a belief of hardline determinism, which I argue is necessary for this theory, you would need 10 to the power of 14 to 10 to the power of 18 operations per second, and that's just to represent each conscious mind, not even including the number of non-conscious elements you would need to keep track of. Which, again, wouldn't even meet the minimum for our simulation to be of the same character as reality as we know it. However, it is likely that the human central nervous system has a high degree of redundancy on the micro scale to compensate for the unreliability and noisiness of its neuronal components. One would therefore expect a substantial efficiency gain when using more reliable and versatile non-biological processors. This constrains your simulation hardware to a specific type of environment. It must exist somewhere where it is shielded from radiation that can fuck with your circuits. There are at least 6 types of this sort of radiation: electromagnetic interference, ionizing radiation, cosmic rays, solar radiation, neutron radiation, and thermal neutrons. All of these, except neutron radiation and thermal radiation, would be more common anywhere other than on a planet with Van Allen belts. So our hardware must either exist on a planet with Van Allen belts, which imposes size limits, or in a location that solves this problem, in which case, where is that? Moreover, since the maximum human sensory bandwidth is approximately 10 to the power of 8 bits per second, simulating all sensory events incurs a negligible cost compared to simulating the cortical activity. We can therefore use the processing power required to simulate the central nervous system as an estimate of the total computational cost of simulating a human mind. If Searle's Chinese room thought experiment is wrong, then simulating conscious human minds may very well be possible. But the difference between simulating a thing that is conscious and the historical conscious minds as they recreate human history is precisely where the necessity for a true theory of everything is most apparent. Furthermore, this is another place where the quasi-solipsist nature of this theory is exposed. It would work to only simulate the mind if we were only simulating the mind of a single consciousness in a vacuum. But it doesn't work when there are many minds to be simulated. This is because if we are truly simulating conscious minds, there has to be some objective medium through which we can synchronize the events of the independent experiences of each conscious mind. In this case, our objective medium would be a ridiculous amount of processing power and memory. Simply approximating away every mystery won't solve this. Each instantiation of these approximations within our simulated objective medium would add to an ever-increasing set of errors that would cause our simulations to deviate from true history. And each of those errors would be magnified by the butterfly effect. The only way around this problem would be to take an accurate accounting of history and hard code our simulations to match the events of this supplementary real account. Which sounds like it could work until you realize that even the most accurate historical records we have contain errors that we don't and can't know about. And if we wanted to correct those errors out of our supplementary accounting, we would either have to have a bidirectional time machine, which defeats the purpose of running ancestor simulations in the first place, or we would have to have a perfect deterministic theory of everything that we could use to discover them. If the environment is included in the simulation, this will require additional computing power. How much depends on the scope and granularity of the simulation. Simulating the entire universe down to the quantum level is obviously infeasible, unless radically new physics is discovered. Correct. I'm glad that he admitted this problem, and if the simulation can't do that, then our reality is more complex than the simulations, and therefore our reality is likely not a simulation. But in order to get a realistic simulation of human experience, much less is needed. Only whatever is required to ensure that the simulated humans interacting in normal human ways with their simulated environment don't notice any irregularities. This might be true for an Amazon delivery driver, but not a quantum physicist or some other type of scrupulous observer. The extent to which we can study quantum physics or any scientific frontier and potentially solve mysteries completely obliterates this assumption that we wouldn't need a perfect simulation, especially if the idea is that we might currently be in this sort of approximated simulation. Being tricky is not good enough, because our errors will get worse and more obvious as we run the simulation for longer durations. The microscopic structure of the inside of the Earth can be safely omitted. Tell that to a geologist. Is Nick just going to continue to assert that everything we don't currently know to a T is not necessary? Because this is a wild streak of asserting this non-falsifiable quality. Omitting the microscopic details of the Earth's interior would quickly be noticed by these experts, who require accurate data for their research and predictions. Moreover, Bostrom's assertion that certain details can be omitted because they are not currently known or observed introduces a dangerous precedent of non-falsifiability by claiming that any aspect of reality we don't currently have a great understanding about is unnecessary for a convincing simulation. The hypothesis becomes unfalsifiable. This undermines the scientific validity of the argument, as it relies on the inability to disprove certain assumptions. For example, understanding the microscopic structure of the Earth is crucial for predicting natural disasters, exploring natural resources, and studying the planet's history and evolution. Omitting such details would lead to discrepancies that experts would undoubtedly detect at some point, thus revealing the artificial nature of the simulation. Therefore, a convincing simulation must include all aspects of reality, known and unknown, to avoid detection by experts in various fields. Distant astronomical objects can have highly compressed representations. This is basically the same definition of the non-existent firmament that flat earthers believe in, except the word distant is thrown in at the beginning. It looks like the answer to whether we're going to continue asserting non-falsifiable qualities is yes. This fails because these compressed elements have the capacity to continually introduce elements that have tangible effects that would need accounting for. To demonstrate this, let's borrow one of the hypotheticals that I animated for my "I know where to find the records of your entire life" video. We can imagine a possible universe where a stray cosmic ray collides with your next-door neighbor's brain, right in the amygdala, causing a tumor that maximizes his aggression, such that the next morning, as you step outside to take out the trash, he is thrown into an uncontrollable rage and murders you. How would you account for this without a perfectly detailed objective reality surrounding whatever distant cosmic source emitted the ray? To avoid detectable inconsistencies, you would have to account for distant astronomical phenomena. Verisimilitude need extend only to the narrow band of properties that we can observe from our planet or solar system spacecraft. Yeah, this is just flatly not true. It makes sense for the Amazon driver, but not the scientist. The fact that these things can be studied disestablishes the notion that a weak simulation will suffice. On the surface of Earth, macroscopic objects in inhabited areas may need to be continuously simulated, but microscopic phenomena could likely be filled in ad hoc. While there is a meaningful distinction between macro and micro phenomena, they are not completely inseparable in this way. assuming that one can be ignored without affecting the other is flawed. This assumption is like saying, if nobody sees it, then a tree doesn't fall in the woods, when in reality, we know the tree fell because we can go in afterwards and see the log, the impression in the dirt that it made on collision, and infer that it fell via the principle of cause and effect. To assert that it doesn't have to would assert that our assumption that the felled tree followed cause and effect is nothing more than an assumption. That cause and effect are an illusion in our simulated realities, contradicting our hardline deterministic supposition. This continues to undermine the credibility of the simulation hypothesis. While it is not possible to get a very exact estimate of the cost of a realistic simulation of human history, we can use approximately 10 to the power of 33 to 10 to the power of 36 operations as a rough estimate. He's arriving at this number by taking 100 billion humans times 50 years per human times 30 million seconds per year times boundaries of 10 to the power of 14 to 10 to the power of 17 operations in each human brain per second, getting approximately 10 to the power of 33 to 10 to the power of 36 operations. Okay, I don't even know, how specific do we want to be here? This is around 17 billion people off in terms of how many humans have ever existed, but if we're only accounting for conscious minds, then you kinda only need to account for the carrying capacity of human population, since population growth tapers off. Somewhere around 10 billion people. But even with that, we're still 30 years off when it comes to how long human lifespans are, 1.54 million off for the number of seconds per year, and that doesn't account for human bodies, animals, plants, or non-living elements of reality that would be needed for our objective medium. Since there are 10 to the power of 80 atoms, you need no less than that for a perfect simulation, which I argue you absolutely need to have a sufficiently commensurate simulation. While Bostrom only intends this to be a rough estimate, if I'm correct, he is way underestimating. We noted that a rough approximation of computational power of a planetary mass computer is 10 to the power of 42 operations per second, and that assumes only already known nanotechnological designs, which are probably far from optimal. A planetary mass-sized computer wouldn't fit on Earth, and would still need a shielded environment to truly have the superiority to organic computation that he claims. Additionally, our reality doesn't comport with this, since actions can occur at a tick rate faster than once a second. We can conclude that the computing power available to a post-human civilization is sufficient to run a huge number of ancestor simulations, even if it allocates only a minute fraction of its resources to that purpose. We can draw this conclusion even while leaving a substantial margin of error in all our estimates. This only makes sense if it is true that you can create a partial simulation that can determine all of human history. I argue that you cannot do so accurately, not without a perfect theory of everything and enough computation power to describe everything, which thus far has not been demonstrated or argued for. We've just been wasting our time entirely under the assumption that there is such a thing as good enough. There may be a good enough simulation to realistically represent something similar to human history, but actually recreating our human history with perfect accuracy requires more than a good enough solution. But let's now address the bulk of Nick's argument and attempt to understand it before I unload the rest of my criticisms. Defining f of p as the fraction of all human-level technological civilizations that survive to reach a post-human stage, n to be the average number of ancestor simulations run by a post-human civilization, H as the average number of individuals that have lived in such a simulation before it reaches a post-human stage, then the actual fraction of all observers with human-type experiences that live in simulations is F simulation equals f of p times n times h divided by f of p times n times h plus h. Here, the numerator appears to represent what Nick believes would be the total number of simulated consciousnesses, and the denominator appears to be what Nick believes to be the total number of consciousnesses, combining both the number of simulated consciousnesses and the number of, quote, real consciousnesses. Trivially, if we conclude via Searle's Chinese room that simulated individuals are not actually conscious and that they are simply simulating consciousness, then they can't really be counted together with the actual conscious humans of the base reality. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most pertinent criticisms: the problems of sim-eption and falsifiability. Buckle in, because this is about to get fucking complicated. If it were true that reality is something that can be perfectly simulated, and our reality were a simulation, then this would mean that we can generate simulations within simulations. An ostensibly infinite regression of what I call sim-eption. This sort of sim-eption is problematic for both theoretical and practical reasons. There are 4 cases to address in particular. Case 1. Such a simulation would not be possible in the first place, in which case the idea that we could generate such a simulation would remain eternally unverified, and there would be no reason to conclude that we live in a simulation, since we would never have evidence that such simulations are possible. Or case 2, both base reality and simulated reality are deterministic, in which case we need a theory of everything in both the base and simulated realities, in which case there would be no difference between a simulated reality and base reality. Hence, evidence that we exist in a simulation could never be found. Thus, we would never be able to know if we broke out of the simulation or if we traveled through time, since traveling at least forward in time is already demonstrably possible thanks to the relativistic effects of time dilation. Time travel would be infinitely more feasible than breaking out of some deterministic simulation. In this case, the notion that our reality is a simulation would be beyond unfalsifiable. It wouldn't even be conceivably falsifiable. Or, case 3, at the beginning of the chain of sim-eption, there exists a deterministic base reality that is being approximately simulated. If there were only one deterministic base reality, then this would also mean that these simulated realities would not be following cause and effect. It would only follow the illusion of cause and effect within the simulations, in which case, at a certain point, scientific inquiry would clearly become a fundamentally pointless endeavor. Furthermore, if within the simulated realities cause and effect were an illusion, then we would be unable to produce perfect simulations within simulations, as each consecutive simulation would deviate further and further from accurate reality. And we therefore either do not currently exist in a simulation or cannot produce such a simulation. E.g., our presuppositions that we are both capable of these simulations and living in one defy each other, invalidating our reasoning altogether. Or, case 4, there is no deterministic base reality, but there are such simulated realities. Well, if there were not a deterministic base reality, then what exactly is being simulated via approximations? the notion of calling the simulated reality a simulation would cease to make sense. Each consecutive simulation would be not just indistinguishable to us as members of the simulation, but an infinite regression of ontologically exact copies of pseudo-deterministic realities. Without determinism, not only would we be not able to count on a theory of everything bailing us out of our practical problems of building the simulation hardware in the first place, but simulating and predicting exact states would become impossible, undermining the coherence of the so-called simulation hypothesis. There is another interesting note that we can make about this. In my video, I Know Where to Find the Records of Your Entire Life, I discuss what I see as a problem for the traditional trichotomy of hardline determinism versus libertarian free will versus compatibilism. I will provide an overview, but if you want to know more about my thoughts on this problem, I recommend watching that video. While this trichotomy still holds when we are considering conscious decisions very narrowly, there is a problem that hardline determinism and libertarian free will do not cover the same domain, as determinism describes everything, but libertarian free will only covers conscious decisions, and they are therefore only antithetical when we are narrowly considering conscious decision-making. I go so far as to propose a new trichotomy, replacing libertarian free will with a different, harder version that I call hardline free will, in which cause and effect in general is an illusion that arises from some sort of higher power making a series of instantaneous conscious decisions. I also pointed out that unlike hardline determinism or libertarian free will, which can coexist without it, the hardline free will position requires a theological backing to make any sense. If it is the case that our simulated realities do not require a deterministic theory of everything, then those realities would be governed by the illusion of cause and effect, and instantaneous conscious decisions would be practically equivalent to the operations of the computer running the simulation in the higher reality. This sort of implicit adherence to hardline free will would serve as like a litmus test, and strengthen my point that the simulation hypothesis is religious in nature, as we are simply using a computer in a higher reality as our higher power instead of a god, to justify the hardline free will position. And finally, if Sim-eption were possible, then infinite regression could not be infinite, for practical reasons. If our reality is decidedly a thing that can be simulated, and our reality were a simulation, then a commensurate simulation must also allow us to simulate not just the mechanics of a simulated reality, but also allow us to generate a simulation of our simulated reality. And with each layer of simulation, our memory and processing power required for our base simulation goes up infinitely, in correspondence with the number of layers of simulations. This can only go on for so long until we hit a cap for what the base reality can simulate. In this situation, not being able to simulate reality would be the best evidence that we are simulated. But the argument that Bostrom is making is that showing we can simulate reality would show that we likely live in a simulation. This is sometimes called the all roads lead to Rome fallacy, a logical error that precludes a belief from being rationally or scientifically justifiable. If both proof that we are and are not simulated can be used as evidence of the idea that we are living in a simulation, then our entire scenario is unfalsifiable. Therefore, the status of whether or not we live in a simulation is indeterminate. Now, I would like to take a moment to address some of the counter-arguments that I anticipate receiving based on the critical analysis I have presented thus far. Searle's Chinese room is also controversial. This is true, but that is nowhere near the only argument that I put forth. I'm just using it to point out the speculative nature of Bostrom's argument, not saying that it is definitely true. Too much reliance on the alleged necessity of perfect simulations. If you developed approximation methods that are so incredibly accurate that they could never be discovered, then those aren't approximation methods, they're descriptions of reality. Hence, the notion of approximate simulations is moot. Too much reliance on determinism and a potential theory of everything. If you want, you can go back through my reasoning. While I do stress that determinism would be required to get the level of accuracy implied by Bostrom, and that approximations and being tricky aren't good enough, I also engaged with the idea that determinism might not be necessarily true for these simulations. But the less that we rely on determinism for the simulation hypothesis, the less sensical and more philosophically objectionable our hypothesis becomes. Additionally, if you want to suggest that there may be a different set of rules that could replace determinism in this supposed hypothesis, I'm going to immediately turn around and ask you, like what? And laugh at you as you struggle to do anything other than appeal to the mystery of the unknown. Furthermore, it is absurd to say that I can't utilize the potential for a theory of everything to justify my critiques, when the idea I'm critiquing also assumes it, even if it argues that some things can be approximated, circumventing it for such simulated scenarios. Dismissal of technological advancements. If you can get around the technical limits, then you already would have to have more money than could ever exist on the planet Earth, since we don't have access to a planet's mass worth of material capable of composing electronics. And if you could circumvent the more fundamental limits, like the end of Moore's law, in effect, make a computer smaller than fundamental particles, then there aren't enough Nobel Prizes in the world to shower you with. In the meantime, that's impossible. What about quantum computing? While quantum computing has come a long way, it still remains highly specialized and introduces its own set of unique errors, including the problem of quantum decoherence. Their substantial susceptibility to their environment would be even worse for a planetary-sized computer in space. Making a generalized quantum computer is a monumentally difficult goal, let alone getting a practical version of it that can function to practically simulate something as difficult as all of reality. As much as the simulation believers want to appeal to the mystery of what we have yet to discover is impossible, I can equally appeal to the mystery of what we have yet to discover is impossible. And that's about all I got for you. There's certainly more that I could delve into, but I unfortunately don't have the time to go down every single rabbit hole. We didn't go through every line of Nick's paper, and he gives more justification for his broader trilemma as it goes on. But this isn't about debunking the trilemma, it's a critique of the notion that we are currently in a simulation. And to the extent that Nick is presenting the most intellectual of such arguments, I feel as though we've covered enough. If you want to read through the rest of it yourself, I will link it in the description. Also, special shout out to Matt Nye for giving me permission to use his song. He's also linked in the description, and he's an incredible artist. Y'all should check him out. But what do y'all think? Let me know in the comments. Agree or disagree, I hope I gave you some things to think about.
Yeah. A toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. Toast to a good man. Did his best, but it was never good enough for them. It never is. Look. Yo, I'm so lighthearted, feeling so heavy-footed. The things that I've been doing, man, always thought that I wouldn't. It's not that I thought I couldn't, just never went the way it should. I tried so many times and always seemed to murder the good, but now I'm feeling good. Like, what the fuck is that about? I ain't really used to this vibe, easily flying out, crossing seas like it's nothing. Yo, what the fuck, fam? They treated me like I'm well, motherfucking something. Like how I trick these people. Man, I was born in the bottom, I was never treated equal. Pain piling like leaves in autumn. They'll be laughing at your struggles until they're the ones that got them. That's all evil. The world don't like my book, they like the sequel. They ain't fucking with my people. They wanna see us dead. They be happy with a bullet in my head. Fuck them then. Well, fuck them then. Yeah. La da da, a toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. And ba da da, toast to the good man who did his best, but it was never good enough for them. La da da, a toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. And ba da da, toast to that good man who did his best, but it was never good enough for them. I ran out of weed last week. I don't need this beef. 4 fist fights in 2 days. I guess I need this leaf. I need to roll another up, so I'll proceed with peace. I need my peace, but inside trapped with this beast. I gotta tell him every day not to pull my leash before I pull that lever and rest in peace. I'm blessed to breathe. Sometimes I hold my breath. I'm southpaw when I throw my left. I take a couple cursed steps towards my righteous death. My noxious breath probably keep away my ops at best. My first album lifted many pounds off my chest. Said I'll be fine, but to be correct, I don't know how I ain't stretched my neck, how I ain't bite that bullet, how I ain't jump no flying, how I ain't drink that fluid. But if that's what they want, they can suck my dick. I'm probably in your house fucking with your chick. La da da, a toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. And ba da da, toast to the good man who did his best, but it was never good enough for them. La da da, a toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. And ba da da, toast to that good man who did his best, but it was never good enough for them. Ba da da, toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. And la da da, toast to the good man who did his best, but it was never good enough for them. And la da da, toast to the bad guy. With bad bitches, the bad times will pass by. And ba da da, toast to the good man who did his best, but it was never good enough for them.